Your last thought may not end the moment you do. Somewhere inside the dimming circuitry of a dying brain, a final pattern of electricity continues to ripple outward for a few strange seconds, long after the body has gone still. Physicists who study how information behaves in the universe have begun to suspect something quietly astonishing, that the structure of a thought, the precise arrangement of energy that made it real, does not simply vanish, it loosens, it softens, it returns to the field it came from. Welcome gently to a long and slow exploration. If wandering through ideas like these feels like home to you, you might consider staying close to this channel for the nights ahead. There is no hurry tonight, there is nothing to solve, there is only the quiet pleasure of thinking together about something the mind rarely lets itself approach. Over the next few hours, we will move slowly through what physics seems to whisper about the final movement of a mind. We will consider the architecture of a single thought, the cascade that begins when the lights start to dim, and the strange suggestions hidden inside conservation laws, quantum decoherence, and the geometry of time itself. None of this is meant to alarm you. If anything, it is meant to do the opposite, to soften the edges of a question most of us carry without realizing it. So settle in. Let the day fall away. Let the thought of your last thought become, for tonight, simply another curious thing the universe seems to be doing. Try for a moment to hold a single thought in your hand. You cannot. And the deeper you look into what a thought actually is, the stranger this becomes. A thought is not located in any one neuron, the way a word is located on a page. It is not stored in a tiny drawer somewhere behind the eyes. It is something far more delicate and far more beautiful. A pattern briefly held across billions of cells, none of which individually know what they are thinking. Imagine a vast field of fireflies at dusk. Each one flickers on its own rhythm, but every so often, by some quiet conspiracy, thousands of them light up together, and for a brief moment a shape emerges across the field, a wave, a ripple, a fleeting figure of light. Then it dissolves. The fireflies remain, but the shape is gone. Your thoughts are something like this. The neurons stay. The pattern passes. Inside the brain, this pattern is made of small electrical events called action potentials. Each neuron sits patiently at a kind of resting voltage, like a cup held just below the brim, and when enough signals arrive at once, the cup overflows. A pulse of electricity races down the cell, triggering chemicals that whisper to the next neuron, and the next, and the next. A single thought is the choreography of perhaps 100 billion such whispers, all timed with an almost musical precision. What makes this so quietly astonishing is that the cells themselves do not change very much from one thought to another. The same neurons that hold your memory of childhood will, in the next second, hold the smell of coffee, or the face of a stranger, or the sudden urge to look out the window. The hardware stays. The pattern flows through it like weather through a sky, and weather is perhaps the most honest way to describe a thought. A storm is not a thing that lives somewhere. It is what the atmosphere is doing for a while. A thought is not a thing that lives in your head. It is what your brain is doing for a while. When the thought passes, nothing has been lost from the brain itself, just as nothing is lost from the sky when a cloud disperses. This shifts something gentle in how we might see ourselves. We tend to imagine we are containers full of thoughts, like a library of small objects, but we may be closer to a river, the same river, hour after hour, made of entirely new water every second. Your sense of being you is not a stored item. It is an ongoing pattern, refreshed continually, like a candle flame that looks steady only because it is burning so smoothly. And if a thought is a pattern, then the question of what happens to your last thought becomes a different sort of question. It is no longer about where a thing goes, it is about what happens when a pattern, long sustained, finally lets itself dissolve. That is the path we are quietly beginning to walk tonight, with no urgency and no need to arrive anywhere at all. There is a small illusion happening inside you right now, and you have never once noticed it. The moment you call this very instant is not actually this very instant. It is something already slightly behind, By the time the world reaches you, the sound in the room, the weight of the blanket, the soft pressure of your own breath, your brain has already been working on it for a fraction of a second. What you call now is in truth a very recent memory. Most people imagine that thought travels at the speed of light because we are used to electricity moving that fast through wires. But the brain does not work like a wire. Its signals travel down long, thin fibers called axons, some of them wrapped in a fatty insulation that helps speed things along, and even the fastest of these signals moves at around 100 meters per second. That sounds quick until you compare it to light, which is nearly 3 million times faster. Inside your head, thought is, in cosmic terms, almost slow, and yet in human terms, it feels instantaneous. You touch a warm cup and you feel warmth immediately. You hear a word and you understand it without any sense of delay. The reason for this is that the brain quietly hides the lag from you. It assembles the world behind the scenes, lining up sights and sounds and sensations, so they arrive in your awareness already stitched together. The lag is real, but it is invisible. You live inside a beautifully edited version of reality. Researchers have measured this gap in different ways, and they often arrive at something close to a fifth of a second between an event and your full conscious experience of it. 200 milliseconds, a small window, but a meaningful one. In that window, an entire orchestra of neurons has fired, conferred, adjusted, and presented you with the polished moment you call your present. There is something quietly humbling in this. The world you are experiencing tonight is, in a sense, already in the past. The voice you are listening to has already finished forming the words by the time you understand them. The thoughts arising in your own mind are slightly older than the version of you that notices them. We are, all of us, gently living on a small delay, a soft echo of what just happened. And this raises a tender question about the last thought. If thinking always lives a little behind the present, then perhaps the final thought is not exactly the final moment. Perhaps it is the brain's last gentle echo of something that has already happened, a quiet reflection arriving just slightly after the event it describes. The mind, even at its end, may still be doing what it has always done, catching up, with great care, to a reality that has already moved on. Tonight, as your own thoughts drift, you can let this idea rest beside you. The present is always a little bit later than we think, and the mind, even slow as it is, has always been generous enough to make that delay feel like presence. There is a small glowing fact about you that almost no one ever mentions. Right now, sitting quietly, doing nothing in particular, your brain is producing about as much electrical power as a dim light bulb, around 20 watts, not much by household standards, but enough in its own way to run the most intricate piece of working machinery anyone has ever found in the known universe. That number, 20 watts, feels almost too modest. With this small amount of energy, the brain manages to recognize faces, compose sentences, dream of distant places, regret old decisions, and, somewhere in the middle of all that, ask itself what it is. A laptop running far simpler tasks may use 5 times more power. The brain accomplishes everything you are on the energy budget of a reading lamp, and this energy does not stay sealed inside your skull. It hums softly outward. The electrical activity of the brain creates faint magnetic fields that ripple just beyond the surface of the head. Fields so delicate that detecting them requires rooms shielded from the rest of the world, and instruments cooled close to absolute zero. But they are real. Every thought you have is, in a very small way, broadcast. When researchers place sensors on the scalp, they pick up these signals as patterns of rhythm, slow, sweeping waves when you are deeply asleep, faster, lighter ripples when you are calm and awake, sharp, racing patterns when you are concentrating. These are the rhythms of millions of neurons agreeing to fire together, like crowds in a stadium clapping in time. The brain does not just think, it hums in chords. There is something quietly remarkable in realizing this. The space immediately around you is not empty. It carries a faint imprint of you, the soft electromagnetic signature of whatever you happen to be thinking right now. It fades quickly with distance, just inches really, But for those few inches, the air is a little bit you. Two people sitting close together are, in some small sense, sharing the outer edges of their own quiet weather. Of course, these fields are too faint to carry meaning across a room, let alone across the world. They are not telepathy. They are not signals in any practical sense, but they are something more philosophically interesting. They are evidence that thinking is not entirely contained. A thought has an inside, where it feels like something, and an outside, where it leaves a trace on the physics of the room. When the last thought arrives, this small electrical hum begins to slow, the rhythms loosen, the chords break apart into individual notes, and then into silence. But for as long as the brain has been alive, it has been quietly giving itself to the world in this way, releasing a soft, invisible signature into the air around it. Not a message, just a presence. Tonight you can sit with the gentle strangeness of this. The room you are in is not only holding you, it is also, very faintly, holding the outer edge of your thinking. And somewhere in that small overlap between mind and air, the boundary between you and the world becomes a little less certain than it usually feels. There is a question that, once you notice it, becomes very difficult to put down. Where exactly does a thought begin? Not where it is felt, that is easier, but where it actually starts, before it becomes a thought at all. Try to catch the very first instant of your next idea. You will find that you cannot. By the time you notice it, it is already there, fully formed, as if it had been waiting just out of sight. In the 1980s, a researcher named Benjamin Libet performed a now famous set of experiments. He asked people to make a simple movement, to flex a finger whenever they felt like it, and to note the exact moment they made the decision. While they did this, he measured the electrical activity in their brains. What he found surprised almost everyone. The brain began preparing for the movement nearly half a second before the person felt themselves deciding to move. The decision, in other words, seemed to arrive in awareness slightly after it had already begun in the body. This does not have to mean what some have read into it. It does not necessarily mean that free will is an illusion, or that you are simply watching a play your brain has already written. There are many gentler interpretations, but it does suggest that the moment of decision, the moment a thought begins, is not where we usually imagine it to be. Something earlier is happening, in the quiet folds of neural tissue, before you ever hear the inner voice that calls it yours. Modern brain scans have added another layer to this mystery. When you are not doing anything in particular, not focused on a task, not solving a problem, a particular set of brain regions becomes more active, not less. This is sometimes called the default mode network, and it seems to be what the brain does in its spare time. Wander, drift, reminisce, imagine. Many of your most spontaneous thoughts seem to bubble up from this quiet undercurrent, as if the mind has its own private weather, always moving, even when you are not watching. And so the question deepens. If thoughts begin in places you cannot see, in moments before you are aware, then perhaps thoughts are less things you produce and more things you receive, not from outside necessarily, but from a part of yourself you do not directly meet. You become, in a sense, the audience of your own mind, the one who notices the thoughts after they have already begun to form, and politely calls them yours. There is something restful in this if you let it be. The pressure to generate every thought softens. The next thought is already on its way, gathering quietly in some hidden corner of you. You do not need to summon it. You only need to let it arrive. And when the last thought begins, it too will be gathering somewhere in this quiet place, just before awareness notices. Perhaps the final movement of the mind is not a sudden act, but the soft completion of something that started a little earlier than anyone could see. For most of history, people assumed that thinking happened in the head, and the rest of the body simply carried it around. The skull was the throne room, everything below was the kingdom. But the more carefully we look, the less true this picture seems. Some of your thinking, it turns out, is not happening in your brain at all. Wrapped around your gut is a network of nerves so dense and intricate that researchers sometimes call it the second brain. It contains roughly as many nerve cells as the spinal cord, and it runs many of its operations on its own without needing instructions from above. You have felt this network at work, even if you never named it. That uneasy feeling before bad news, that quiet calm after a good meal, that strange certainty in your stomach when something is wrong. The gut is, in its own quiet way, an organ of intuition. Connecting it to the brain is a long, wandering nerve called the vagus. The name comes from the Latin word for wanderer, and the nerve earns it. It drifts through the chest, brushes the heart and lungs, and reaches deep into the digestive organs, carrying messages in both directions. Far more of those messages travel upward, from body to brain, than downward, from brain to body. Most of what you call thought is being shaped, behind the scenes, by signals rising from beneath. The heart, too, sends its own kind of information. It has its own small cluster of neurons, sometimes called the heart-brain, and it responds to emotion and attention in ways the skull brain quietly listens to. When you feel something deeply, your heart rhythm changes, and that change is read by your brain almost like a sentence. There is a reason that, across nearly every culture in history, people have placed the seat of emotion in the chest rather than the head. They were not being poetic. They were noticing something real. This means that what you experience as a thought is in truth a collaboration. The brain provides the words and the shape, but the body provides the color and the weight. A worry feels heavy because the gut is tense. A moment of love feels warm because the chest is open. Even a memory carries its old physical sensations along with it, faint echoes of the body that first lived through it. And so, the last thought is unlikely to be a purely mental event. It is more likely to be a final, gentle conversation between every part of you. The brain may carry the words, but the heart, the lungs, the gut, the slow movement of blood, all of them will be speaking too, in their own quieter languages. The mind is not a lonely tenant in the head, it is the soft agreement of an entire body listening to itself. There is something tender in this. You are not, and have never been, only a brain wrapped in flesh. You are a deeply connected creature, thinking with your whole self at once, and when the time comes for the last thought, it will not be the brain alone that thinks it. The whole body will be there, the way it has always been, finishing the sentence together. There is a soft borderland in every life that we all visit every single night, without ever managing to remember it. It is the place between being awake and falling asleep, that narrow strip of minutes where thoughts begin to drift, where images appear without invitation, where the rules of ordinary thinking begin to loosen. You step across it every night, and you have never once seen what it actually looks like. This borderland is interesting because it shows us something rare. It shows us what consciousness looks like when it is dimming, not gone, not yet, but loosening its grip. In a brain scan, this transition is visible. Certain fast rhythms, the kind that hum in the background of focused, alert thinking, sometimes called gamma waves, begin to soften. Slower, broader waves rise up beneath them. The brain stops behaving like a single, unified conversation and begins to break into smaller, quieter local pockets. There is a theory in neuroscience, sometimes called global workspace theory, that tries to describe what conscious awareness actually is. The idea is roughly this: at any moment, many different parts of the brain are doing many different things, mostly in private, but every so often, certain information becomes loud enough, important enough, or coordinated enough that it gets broadcast across the whole brain at once. That broadcast, that moment when the brain agrees to share something with itself, is what we experience as conscious thought. If this is even partly true, then awareness is not a constant glow. It is more like a series of bright signals lighting up a darker network. When you are fully awake, those signals are frequent and well coordinated. When you drift towards sleep, they grow farther apart, weaker, less synchronized. The broadcasts soften. The brain still works, but it stops telling itself everything, and this gives us a gentle hint about what the very last edge of awareness might feel like. It would not, perhaps, be a sudden snap of darkness. It would be more like an evening room as the sun goes down. The light does not vanish at once. It thins. Some corners stay bright a little longer. The shapes of things begin to soften. At some point, you cannot quite say when, the room has become night, and you did not see the moment it happened. People who study these transitions sometimes describe a strange and beautiful possibility, that there is no sharp boundary between awareness and unawareness. There is only a slow loosening, a gradual quieting, a gentle thinning of the broadcast. The mind does not slam a door behind itself. It simply lets the room grow dim. If this is so, then the edge of the last thought may not be an edge at all. It may be more like a horizon, always slightly further than it looks, always softening into the next thing rather than ending against it. And horizons, as anyone who has watched the sea knows, do not feel like walls. They feel like open distance. Tonight, as your own awareness begins to soften, you are practicing something the universe seems to be very good at, letting one state of being become another, without anyone needing to mark the exact moment it happened. Of all the things the body does in a lifetime, the most underrated may be the simple act of breathing. Right now, without your asking, oxygen is slipping into your blood and traveling, in just a few seconds, to every neuron in your brain. Each of those neurons depends on it utterly, not for the next year or the next hour, but for the next few moments. The mind is, in the most literal sense, kept alive by a continuous quiet delivery. When that delivery slows or stops, the cascade begins. It does not begin with drama, it begins with chemistry. Each neuron in the brain uses a small molecule called ATP, a kind of microscopic battery, to maintain the careful balance of charges that lets it fire signals. ATP is not stored in large amounts. It must be made constantly, mostly from oxygen and glucose. Without oxygen, production falls sharply. Within seconds, the brain has fewer batteries than it needs. What happens next is strangely orderly. The neurons begin to lose the ability to maintain their resting state. Tiny pumps in their membranes, which normally keep certain particles outside and others inside, begin to fail. Charges that should stay separate begin to mix. The careful electrical balance, kept up for decades, starts to soften. This is not collapse in the way we usually imagine it. It is more like a great orchestra running low on light. The musicians do not stop all at once. Some can still see their notes, others can barely make out the page. The melody continues, but it grows thinner. Sections drop out. The conductor, somewhere in the center, keeps the rhythm a little while longer, though the music has begun to thin into something less coherent. The first parts to falter tend to be the regions that work hardest in everyday life. The outer layers of the brain, where attention and language and self-awareness mostly live. These cells burn the most fuel, and they are the first to feel the shortage. Older, deeper regions, the ones that handle heartbeat and breathing, are more frugal, and they hold on longer. The structure of the dimming follows a kind of evolutionary order in reverse. The newer, more elaborate parts of the mind fall quiet first, while the ancient animal core of the brain continues humming a little while more. This means that the last conscious thought, whatever it is happening on a slowly thinning canvas. The vocabulary of the mind is shrinking. The richness of perception is softening. What might feel from inside like a single ordinary moment is, in physical reality, the final coordinated act of a system gracefully running out of fuel. And yet, even in this slow unraveling, there is something beautiful. The cascade is not random. It follows patterns the body has carried since long before any of us were born. It is, in a way, the same kind of pattern by which we fall asleep every night, only deeper, only further. The mind has always known how to dim. It has done it countless times before, on a smaller scale. Tonight, as you drift, the body is performing a much gentler version of this same ancient, careful art. For a long time, the dying brain was assumed to be a quiet one. The expectation was simple, even intuitive. As oxygen disappears, activity should fade until everything goes still. Then, in 2013, a small team at the University of Michigan looked more closely and found something almost no one expected. They were studying the brains of laboratory rats at the moment of cardiac arrest, recording the electrical activity in fine detail. As the hearts of the animals stopped, the brains, instead of falling silent immediately, did something strange. For about 30 seconds, Certain high-frequency rhythms, the same fast, synchronized patterns that appear during deeply focused, vivid conscious experience in humans, surged dramatically. The dying brains became, briefly, more electrically organized than they had been while alive. The researchers were careful with their words. They did not claim to have measured a soul or proven the existence of any particular experience, but they did note something undeniable. The dying brain, far from going gently silent, seemed to flare. There was a final bright pulse of activity, neat and coordinated, just at the edge. In the years since, similar patterns have been seen in human recordings. There are now a handful of cases where doctors happened to be monitoring brain activity at the moment a patient passed away, and in some of those cases, the same fast, high-frequency burst appears. In one case, recorded in 2022, a man's EEG showed a flurry of gamma-wave activity in the seconds around his death, the same rhythm that in living people is associated with memory recall, dreaming, and intense focus. It is important to be gentle with what this might mean. No one can know what, if anything, was experienced in that final burst. The brain producing those rhythms is not in a position to tell us, but the existence of the surge is, in itself, an extraordinary clue. The mind, it seems, does not simply switch off. It seems to do something, perhaps reach for something, in its last moments. Some researchers have begun to wonder whether this final surge could be related to the long-reported sense, in near-death experiences, of vivid memories, deep emotional clarity, or a strange feeling of lucidity at the very end. These connections are far from confirmed, but they are no longer ruled out. The surge is real. What it means is still being learned. What this gently invites us to imagine is that the very last conscious experience, if there is one, may not be a fading whimper. It may be something almost paradoxical, a brief bright flowering, occurring just as the rest of the system is preparing to release, like a candle that flares a little brighter the instant before its flame dissolves into smoke. Tonight, you do not need to draw any conclusion from this. You can simply let it rest in your mind as a small, curious truth about what bodies do. The brain, in its final act, seems unwilling to leave quietly. It seems to want to give one last clear signal, bright, organized, unmistakably alive, before it lets the room grow dim. There is something quietly moving in that. The mind, even at the end, still seems to be reaching out toward the world. People who have come close to death and returned often say the same odd thing about time. They describe moments that, by the clock, lasted only seconds, but inside felt like minutes, even hours, entire stretches of life, replayed in vivid detail, long conversations finished, whole landscapes of memory walked through unhurried. The body, meanwhile, was barely moving. The watch on the wrist had hardly stirred. This phenomenon, sometimes called the life review, is far older than any modern research. Survivors of near drownings, falls, and accidents have described it for centuries. What is interesting is not whether it always happens, it does not, but how consistently those who report it describe a sense of stretched, slowed, almost spacious time. Something about the edge of life seems to do something to our usual sense of how seconds pass. Modern neuroscience offers a few quiet possibilities. One has to do with what is called the temporal binding window. Normally, the brain stitches together moments into units of perceived time, about a few hundred milliseconds wide. Anything that happens inside one of these windows feels like a single experienced moment. When the brain is under extreme conditions, those windows can shorten dramatically. Each moment becomes finer-grained. More events are noticed per second. Subjectively, time feels slower because more is being packed into less of it. Something like this happens, in a smaller way, when people are frightened. Witnesses of accidents often report feeling as if everything moved in slow motion. Their brains were not actually speeding up. They were sampling reality more densely than usual. The world looked slow because the mind was looking at it more carefully. Now picture what this might be like at the very edge of life, when the brain is undergoing a final, intense surge of activity. If sampling becomes denser still, if memories are being replayed by the hippocampus at high speed, if the mind is moving through internal landscapes at a rhythm we never normally experience, then by every subjective measure, time would expand. A second would not feel like a second. It would feel like a small forever. There is also another piece. Memory itself is a strange thing. Researchers have found that the brain, during certain restful or compressed states, can replay long sequences of experience in fast bursts, sometimes condensing what took minutes in real life into a fraction of a second of neural activity. If this kind of fast replay were happening at the end, then an entire life, in its broad strokes, could indeed be revisited inside a window that, from outside, looked terribly brief. What this hints at is gentle and a little dizzying. The final moment, measured by anyone watching, may be short. Measured from inside, it may not be short at all. Time, after all, is not entirely a property of the world. It is partly something the mind constructs as it goes, and when the mind is doing something extraordinary, time itself can become extraordinary along with it. There is something deeply consoling in this. Whatever the last thought is, the person having it may not feel rushed. They may, in fact, be inside a moment that by their own clock is taking all the time it needs. Beneath everything we have spoken of so far, the patterns, the surges, the stretched time, there is also a quieter layer of the story, a chemical one. Throughout the body's slow transition, certain substances rise, others fall, and the inner weather of the brain shifts in ways we are only beginning to map. One molecule that has captured a great deal of speculation is dimethyltryptamine, or DMT. It is a naturally occurring compound that the body produces in small amounts, though where and why remain partly mysterious. In larger doses taken externally, DMT is known to produce extraordinarily vivid, dreamlike experiences. Some researchers have wondered whether the brain might release a surge of DMT, or something like it, during the dying process, and whether this could partly explain the strange, luminous quality so often reported in near-death accounts. It is important to be careful here. The science is still young, and the evidence is far from settled. We do not yet know how much DMT, if any, the brain releases at the end of life. We do not know whether such a release would shape conscious experience or simply ripple through unnoticed. What we can say is that the idea is plausible enough to take seriously and humble enough to leave as a soft possibility rather than a confident claim. There are other chemical shifts that are better documented. Endorphins, the body's natural painkillers, the same molecules released during long runs or moments of intense laughter, appear to rise during severe physical stress, including dying. So do certain other compounds that quiet pain and bring a kind of inner softening. The body, faced with the most intense moment it will ever know, often responds by releasing chemistry that dulls the edges, dims the alarms, and offers something almost like peace. Serotonin and other mood-shaping molecules can also shift in the final stages, sometimes in ways that produce a sense of meaningfulness or warmth. None of this is guaranteed. Different deaths look different, some are peaceful, some are not. But the pattern that emerges again and again is one of a body trying in its quiet way to soften its own transition. There is something tender about this. Evolution does not always seem kind, but here it appears to have built in a small mercy. The same body that has woken every morning and walked through years of ordinary life seems also to know how to dim its own lights with as little distress as possible. And so, the chemistry of the last thought may not be sharp. It may be more like the chemistry of a long, slow exhale. The brain, in its final reckoning, appears to be doing more than simply running out. It is, in some sense, smoothing itself towards stillness. Whatever the last thought turns out to be, it is unlikely to arrive in a stark or hostile chemistry. It is more likely to arrive in a soft one, softened by endorphins, possibly coloured by something stranger and more wondrous, but in any case carried on a tide that the body itself prepared. The mind does not have to grasp this, it only has to let it happen, and, when the time comes, it seems the body knows how. Long before researchers began studying the dying brain, they had already noticed something curious about the resting brain. When a person, or even a sleeping animal, stops engaging with the outside world, certain memory regions, particularly a small seahorse-shaped structure called the hippocampus, begin to replay recent experiences at high speed. A maze that took a rat several minutes to run might be replayed in its neurons in just a few seconds, sometimes forwards, sometimes backwards. The brain seems to use its quiet time to revisit, in compressed form, what just happened. These bursts of replay are called sharp wave ripples, and they are not random. They tend to involve the very experiences that are still being woven into long-term memory. It is as if the brain, when not busy living, becomes busy reliving, and in doing so it strengthens what matters and lets go of what does not. If you sit with this idea for a moment, something gentle becomes apparent. Every night, in deep sleep, your brain has already been holding a kind of small private review. It has gone back over the day, it has played and replayed certain scenes. It has slowly decided which moments to keep clearly, which to fade, and which to braid together. Without your awareness, the inner life of memory has been steadily rehearsed. Now picture this same process running at a different scale, not the scale of a single day, but the scale of a whole life. At the edges of consciousness, when the brain is freed from incoming sensation and bathed in its own activity, those replay mechanisms may not just touch on recent events, they may reach further back. Faces from childhood, mornings long forgotten, a particular kind of light through a particular window, the same machinery that compresses a maze into a few seconds may be capable, in the right conditions, of compressing decades into a strange, unhurried instant. This is what some researchers gently suggest may be happening during the much-reported life review. Not a supernatural film unspooling, but the brain doing, on a larger and more vivid scale, what it has been doing every quiet night for years, calling up patterns, stitching them together, replaying, honoring, letting go. There is something deeply human in this possibility. If true, then dying may resemble a final, unhurried act of remembering, rather than the abrupt erasure we often fear. The mind does not go out alone, it goes out with everything it ever held, at least for one last, gentle pass through its own gathered weather. Even the unremembered may briefly return. Memory is not, after all, only the things we can deliberately bring to mind. It is a vast network of associations, smells, textures, and half-formed impressions, most of which sit beneath everyday awareness. In the quiet brightness of a final surge, some of these may rise to the surface, like fish rising in a lake at dusk. You do not need to believe any of this with certainty, but you can let it sit beside you tonight as a soft, kind possibility, that whatever the last thought is, it may not feel like vanishing. It may feel, in some quiet way, like an old, familiar shape coming home to itself, a mind gently visiting everything it has loved before it lets the room grow still. Eventually, of course, the surge softens. The bright burst of activity, however long or short it lasted, gradually loses its coordination. The fast rhythms thin, the slower waves stretch out and out, until they too become less distinct. On a recording of the brain's electrical activity, what was once a busy landscape of peaks and valleys begins to flatten, like a sea settling after a storm. In clinical terms, this flat line is called an isoelectric state. It is the visible sign that the brain has stopped producing the kind of organized electrical activity that supports conscious thought. But it is worth pausing here, because flatness on a recording is not quite the same as nothingness. It is a measurement taken from outside of certain rhythms no longer being present. What is happening inside the cells themselves at that point is far more subtle, far slower, and not entirely silent for some time. Individual neurons can continue small chemical and electrical activity for minutes after the broad rhythms are gone. There are quiet local pulses, lingering ion movements, small last conversations between neighboring cells. None of this is thought, in any meaningful sense. The orchestra has stopped playing, but the instruments are not yet entirely cool. The brain does not pass through a single door. It walks through a long corridor of doors, closing each in turn. There is something quietly dignified in this slow ending. Earlier in this journey, we spoke of the brain as weather. A storm does not vanish at a single point. It softens, drifts apart, leaves the air a little changed for a while afterwards. The dimming of the brain seems to follow a similar grace. The pattern that was you eases its grip on the matter that supported it. The matter remains. The pattern returns slowly to the larger flow. In music, there is a term for the way a final chord lingers in a room after the instruments have stopped playing. The sound has technically ended, but the air is still vibrating, very faintly, with what was just there. For a few seconds, the room itself remembers. The brain's last quiet activity may be something like this. Not the chord itself, but the room remembering it. A soft after-presence of what was, before silence has fully arrived. This may be why so many traditions, across so many cultures, treat the time around a death as a sacred, unhurried space. Long before anyone could measure brainwaves, people sensed that the transition is not a sudden line but a slow, soft fading. They were not wrong. Even modern instruments confirm a kind of slow settling, rather than a clean cut. For those of us still alive tonight, this is a quiet reassurance. The end, when it comes, will not be a violent snap. It will be more like the closing of a long, complicated song. The instruments will lower, one by one. The final chord will hold for a moment, then release into the room, and somewhere in that softening, not a moment we will be able to mark, the silence that always lived underneath the music will be all that remains. There is nothing terrible in a chord ending. It is, in fact, how every piece of music has ever finished. There is a sentence in physics that, once you really hear it, will not leave you alone. It is sometimes called the first law of thermodynamics, but at its heart it says something gentler than its name suggests. Energy cannot be created. Energy cannot be destroyed. It can only change form. Whatever exists in the universe, in terms of pure energy, has always been here, and will always be here, even if it is endlessly rearranged. Take a moment to let that settle. Every shape of energy you have ever encountered, sunlight on a winter morning, the warmth of a cup of tea, the soft heat of your own skin, is part of the same vast, conserved total. None of it is ever lost. It is only transferred, transformed, redistributed. Now apply this to the small, quiet electricity of a thought. A thought, as we have seen, is a pattern of energy moving through the brain. That energy did not appear from nowhere. It came from the food you ate, which came from the soil, which came from minerals shaped over billions of years, which came from the death of long-ago stars. There is a real, traceable line from a thinking moment in your head tonight to the cores of stars that exploded before our planet was born. What happens to that energy when the thought ends? The pattern dissolves, yes, but the energy itself does not. It becomes heat radiating gently into the body and the room. It becomes faint electromagnetic ripple fading into the air. It becomes chemical bonds rearranged in the tissues that remain. Not one tiny fragment of it is gone from the universe. It is only no longer assembled the way it was. This is one of the quieter wonders of physics. The pattern that we call a thought, or a person, or a moment can dissolve. The materials of which that pattern was made cannot. They simply become available for other patterns, other moments, other futures. In the language of accounting, the books always balance. The universe is, by this measure, an unbroken ledger. Now, of course, the energy of a thought is not the same as the thought itself. The pattern is what made the energy mean something, the way a melody is more than the air it moves. When the pattern goes, the meaning in that form goes too. But the substance, the actual stuff, endures almost defiantly beyond every individual moment that uses it. There is something quietly beautiful in living inside such a universe. It does not let things vanish into true nothingness. It does not allow erasure at the most fundamental level. It only allows transformation. The atoms that briefly arranged themselves into the pattern of your last thought will go on, after you, to be part of countless other patterns: soil, rain, leaf, breath, light. They will not remember you, but they will not be lost either. They will simply keep being. This is not yet a complete answer to where a thought goes, but it is a first soft promise. Whatever else is true, The universe seems committed to keeping its accounts in order. Nothing real ever truly disappears. It only becomes something else. And in some quiet sense, that something else is still, in part, what you once were. There is another conservation law in physics, less famous than the first but, in some ways, even more striking. It is the conservation of information. According to the deepest equations we have, information about the past, about every detail of every particle, every nudge, every interaction, is never truly destroyed, scrambled, scattered, hidden beyond all hope of practical recovery, yes. But in principle, it remains in the universe somewhere, in the fine print of all that follows. This may sound abstract, so it helps to bring it close. Imagine burning a single page of a book. The page becomes ash, smoke, heat, and light. From a human point of view, the page is destroyed, but from the strictest viewpoint of fundamental physics, every molecule that was in that page has gone somewhere. Every photon released has flown somewhere. If you could, somehow, gather every speck of smoke, every released atom, every escaping photon, and reverse their motions exactly, you could, in principle, reconstruct the page. We cannot, of course. The information has scattered too far, into too many directions, with too many interactions, but it has not been deleted from the universe. It has only been hidden so thoroughly that, for us, it might as well be gone. This idea sits at the heart of one of the strangest debates in modern physics, the black hole information paradox. When matter falls into a black hole, it seems, on first glance, as if its information vanishes entirely. The black hole appears to swallow not just the matter, but every trace of what that matter was. This troubled physicists deeply, because it would mean that one of the universe's most cherished principles can be broken. The argument has continued for decades, with extraordinarily creative answers proposed. Some have suggested that the information is subtly encoded in the radiation that black holes slowly emit. Others have proposed that it lives on the black hole's outer surface, like writing on the edge of a closing door. There is no final agreement, but a quiet consensus has been forming. Many physicists now believe that information in some form is conserved even there. The universe, it seems, is reluctant to truly forget anything. Now bring this back gently to a single human mind. Each thought, each memory, each moment of awareness is, at its most basic level, a pattern of information. When that pattern dissolves, the information may scatter into heat and chemistry and faint radiation in a way no one could ever practically reconstruct. But in the strictest physical sense, some physicists propose that information has not been erased. It has been rewritten into the world in such a fine, distributed way that we lose all track of it. It is no longer accessible, but it may not be gone. This is not a claim about an afterlife. It is not a claim about consciousness surviving. It is something quieter and stranger, a quiet hint that the universe, at its deepest level, may not allow true deletion. Every detail of every life, in its most basic informational form, may have left a trace in the texture of all that followed. It is a strange kind of comfort. Not loud, not promising, but real, in the careful, humble language of physics. The universe seems to keep, in some manner we do not yet fully understand, a record of itself. In quantum physics, there is a strange and persistent puzzle that has resisted every clean answer for almost a century. It is sometimes called the measurement problem. At its heart is a simple observation that becomes very strange the longer you look at it. Tiny things, particles, waves, packets of energy, behave very differently when they are being watched than when they are not. Before observation, they exist in a kind of cloud of possibilities. The moment they are measured, that cloud collapses, and one definite outcome appears. No one fully understands why this happens. The mathematics describing the cloud of possibilities is beautifully precise. The mathematics describing the collapse, when measurement happens, is more elusive. Different physicists have proposed different ways of dealing with this. Some say there is no real collapse at all, only the appearance of one. Some say the collapse is a genuine feature of the world. Some say the act of conscious observation itself is somehow involved. This last possibility, that consciousness plays a role in the way reality settles, was once seriously discussed by some of the founders of quantum theory. The mathematician John von Neumann and the physicist Eugene Wigner considered whether the chain of measurement might, in some sense, only terminate when a conscious mind takes in the result. Most modern physicists do not hold this view in its strong form. There are gentler interpretations that do not require consciousness at all. But the question has never quite gone away. Now, no responsible physicist would claim that human consciousness creates the universe in some grand mystical way. The world existed long before any of us, and will continue long after. But there is something quietly thought-provoking in the way some interpretations weave observation into the fabric of reality. They suggest, at the very least, that observers' minds, awareness, attention are not entirely separate from the world they observe. They are part of how it shows itself. If even a faint version of this is true, then what happens when one of those observers falls silent? When a particular mind with its particular way of paying attention stops attending? The world does not, of course, vanish. Other observers remain, but a specific way of holding the world, a specific lens through which the universe was being seen, is no longer active. You can sit with this gently. Each conscious life is, in a sense, one of the universe's countless points of view. From inside your own mind, the world has been arranged in a way that no other point of view will ever quite repeat. Your particular angle on a sunset, your particular flavor of memory, your particular weighting of what mattered. When the last thought passes, that particular angle is no longer being held. This does not mean the universe loses something it cannot replace. There are countless other observers, countless other points of view always arising. But there is a tender philosophical truth here. The world is not a single fixed scene watched from nowhere. It is, in some real sense, a vast collection of perspectives, each one quietly shaping how reality appears. The last thought, then, may be more than a personal event. It may be a small, quiet moment in which one of the universe's many lenses turns slowly away from the window after a long life of looking out. There is a quiet truth in physics that touches almost everything. Things tend to spread out. Heat flows from hot to cold, not the other way round. A drop of ink, placed gently into water, slowly disperses. It does not gather itself back into a single point. A glass shatters easily. The pieces do not, of their own accord, leap back into a glass. The universe in its grandest tendency moves from order toward more disorder, from arrangement towards spreading. This tendency is called entropy. It is one of the few things in physics that defines a direction in time. Most laws of physics work just as well backwards as forwards. A film of a planet orbiting a star looks reasonable run either way, but a film of a shattered glass reassembling itself, of smoke gathering back into a candle, immediately looks wrong. The arrow of time in everyday life is the arrow of increasing entropy. The physicist Ludwig Boltzmann saw, more than a century ago, that this arrow is not really about destruction. It is about probability. There are vastly more ways for things to be disordered than to be ordered. A neat arrangement is rare. A messy one is common. So as time passes, systems drift naturally toward the more common kinds of configurations. The universe is not collapsing. It is simply exploring the wider, more probable shapes available to it. Now bring this gently into the world of feeling. Our sense of time, of past and future, of moments slipping behind us, is not a separate thing from the rest of the physical world. It seems to be intimately tied to entropy. We remember the past because the past was more ordered than the present, and our brains can read traces of that lost order. We feel the future as open because there are countless less ordered configurations the world has not yet drifted into. Without entropy, the very experience of time as a flow may not exist in the way we know it. This means that our deepest feeling of being alive in time, of having yesterdays and tomorrows, may itself be a kind of long, ongoing thought. A thought made of entropy gradients. It is the brain's way of reading the universe's tendency to spread, and like every thought, it has to come from somewhere, and it has to eventually quiet. Some have wondered, very softly, whether the last conscious thought might be the brain's final agreement with this tendency. A long life is, in many ways, a long resistance to entropy. The body works ceaselessly to maintain order, repairing, rebuilding, reorganizing. Every breath, every heartbeat, every meal is a small pushback against the universe's drift. When that effort finally eases, what remains is a body and a mind quietly returning to the same patient flow that everything else follows. In that sense, the last thought may not be a fall away from the universe, but a final coming into harmony with it. Not a battle lost, but a long, patient agreement reached. There is something gentle in this view. Nothing about the dying mind is unnatural. It is doing what every river does when it reaches the sea, what every candle does when its wax is gone, what every galaxy is, slowly doing. The world has always moved this way. The mind is simply at last moving with it. In quantum theory, there is a delicate idea that helps explain why the strange behavior of tiny things, the way they exist in clouds of possibility, does not generally show up in the larger world we live in. It is called decoherence. The basic idea is this: when a tiny system capable of being in many states at once comes into contact with its environment, the environment effectively reads it. Through countless small interactions, the cloud of possibilities is rapidly stitched into the larger world, and what was once a quiet superposition becomes part of the ordinary, definite reality we experience. For a long time, some physicists wondered whether the brain might harness this quantum strangeness to do its thinking. Could consciousness be, in some sense, a quantum process held delicately inside the warm tissue of the brain? The physicist Max Tegmark, decades ago, did some careful calculations and gently suggested that the brain is, by quantum standards, too warm, too wet, and too crowded for any such fragile state to last more than a tiny fraction of a second. Any quantum cloud inside a neuron would decohere, would be read by its environment almost immediately. Thinking, by his accounting, is unlikely to be a quantum dance. This was, in one sense, a humbling result. It seemed to push consciousness firmly back into the realm of ordinary classical physics. But there is another way of looking at it, quieter and more poetic. Decoherence is not a destructive process in itself. It does not erase anything. It simply hands a small system over to the larger one around it. The possibilities do not disappear. They are absorbed into the richer texture of the world. Now bring this image gently toward the end of a life. As the brain begins to dim, the precise patterns that supported the mind become harder to maintain. Cells lose their careful timing, rhythms loosen. In a sense, the brain's own coherent pattern, the unified hum that we call thought, begins to lose its ability to hold itself apart from the noisy background of the body and the world. The pattern decoheres, not in a strict quantum sense, but in a deeply analogous one. What was once a tightly held arrangement of energy becomes more entangled with its surroundings. The heat that the brain produces flows into the body and the air. The chemical states it maintained begin to balance with those around them. The mind, which once stood briefly distinct against the surrounding world, begins to be reread by that world. This is not perhaps an erasure. It is a softening of edges. The pattern that was once sharply outlined now blends, gradient by gradient, into everything around it, like a delicate cloud melting back into a sky, or a drop of ink finally finishing its slow spread through water. There is no moment of vanishing. There is only a moment when the distinction between you and not you becomes too gentle to hold on to. If you let yourself sit with this image, something quietly comforting emerges. Whatever the last thought is, it is not a falling off a cliff. It is a long, patient softening into the larger field. The mind, having stood briefly distinct for a few decades, finally allows itself to be read fully by everything around it. And in doing so, it gives itself back to the world that lent it the materials in the first place. Here is a strange question to hold in the dark. If a moment lasts only a fraction of a second by the clock, but feels, from inside, like a small forever, which of these two measurements is more honest? The clock is precise, it does not lie, but the inside experience is the only one that knows what the moment was like. and often, between these two, they do not agree. We touched earlier on how time can stretch in extreme moments, how the brain can sample reality more densely, how memory can replay decades in seconds. Physics offers, in a gentle parallel, another kind of stretching of time. In Einstein's relativity, time is not a fixed background. It flows differently for different observers, depending on their motion and on the gravity around them. An astronaut moving very fast, or a clock placed near a massive object, ticks at a slightly different rate than one sitting peacefully at home. There is no single universal now shared by all of reality. Time is woven into space and bends with it. If outer time can stretch and shift like this, then inner time, the time experienced by a mind, has even more room to surprise us. Inside the brain, the very act of measurement is generated, moment by moment, by neural processes. If those processes slow, speed up, or rearrange themselves at the end of life, then the felt length of that final moment is not bound by what any external clock reports. This means something quietly extraordinary may be possible. A final thought, by every outside measurement, might last only the briefest flicker. By the experience of the one having it, it might feel like much, much more. Not because anything supernatural is happening, but because time, even ordinary time, is something each mind continuously builds. Some thinkers have gone gently further and asked whether the very last moment might, in some functional sense, never end from the inside. Imagine that the brain's sampling of reality becomes finer and finer, that more events are packed into less and less external time, that the subjective unit of experience now stretches as the outside clock slows towards zero. From outside, it would all be done in a heartbeat. From inside, it might feel like sinking softly into something without a visible far shore. This is highly speculative. It is not a claim about what definitely happens, but it is a gentle possibility that some have considered, treating it not as a promise but as an open thought experiment. Consider how this changes the emotional weight of a final moment. The familiar fear is that the last instant will be over too quickly, that something precious will be lost in a blink. But if the inner geometry of that moment is, for whatever reason, vastly larger than the outer one, then there may be far more space inside it than we usually imagine. Time enough to take in something quietly meaningful. Time enough, perhaps, to let go without haste. You do not have to believe any of this with certainty. You can rest it on a shelf, the way you might rest a strange and lovely book. Inner time, after all, has always been a little kinder than the clock. Tonight, as you drift, your own sense of time is already softening. Perhaps it has always known how to do this. Most of us live with a quiet, unspoken picture of time. The past is gone, finished, no longer there. The present is the thin, glowing edge where existence is currently happening. The future is a kind of mist, real but unwritten. This picture is so deeply woven into how we feel that it almost does not feel like a picture at all. It feels like the way things obviously are. Einstein, however, in working through the implications of his own equations, came to a different view. Within his framework, there is no single universe-wide present. Different observers moving in different ways do not even agree on what counts as happening at the same time. Two events that look simultaneous to one observer may be slightly out of order for another. The very notion of a flowing universal now begins to dissolve when you look at it carefully. This led some physicists and philosophers to a strange and provocative possibility, sometimes called the block universe view or eternalism. In this picture, all moments of time exist together as a single great structure. The past has not vanished. It is simply located in a different region of the structure. The future is not unwritten. It is simply located in a region we have not yet experienced. Time in this view is more like a vast landscape than a moving stream. We move through it the way a traveler moves through a country, but the country does not flicker in and out of existence as we cross it. This is one model. Many physicists hold it, many others do not. There are alternative interpretations that take time more seriously, as something genuinely flowing, genuinely open in the future. The point is not to settle the question, but to notice what the block universe view would gently imply if it were true. If all moments exist together, then your last conscious thought is not, in some deep sense, ever erased. It is located somewhere in the great structure of space-time, just as your first laugh as a baby is located somewhere, and the moment you are listening to these words is located somewhere. None of these moments would, in this view, ever cease to be. They would simply be elsewhere along the dimension we call time. It is a strange comfort and a strange disorientation at once. On one hand, nothing that ever happens is truly gone. The afternoon you barely remember, the late conversation that mattered more than you knew, the small kindness you almost did not notice, all of them in this picture are permanently woven into the fabric of reality, sitting quietly in their corner of time. On the other hand, the future is, in some sense, already there too, including moments we have not yet lived. This view does not require us to give up any of our intuitions about meaning or choice. It simply suggests, with great quietness, that time may be far less of a thief than we tend to assume. Things may not slip away in the absolute sense. They may only slip out of immediate reach. If even a hint of this is true, then the final thought, whatever it turns out to be, is not annihilated when it passes. It is permanently part of the structure of what has been and what is. The universe does not undo it. It only moves on past it, while it continues quietly to be what it was. Quantum physics has its own strange way of making us reconsider what counts as one event. In the standard interpretation, when a tiny system is observed and its cloud of possibilities settles into one outcome, the other possibilities are simply gone. They did not happen. There was one roll of the cosmic dice and only one result. But in 1957, a young physicist named Hugh Everett offered a different way of looking at it, gentler in some sense, stranger in another. Everett's idea, now sometimes called the many worlds interpretation, suggested that the cloud never really collapses at all. Instead, every possible outcome of every quantum interaction actually happens, but in different branches of reality. Each branch is fully real in its own right. We, as conscious observers, end up in one of those branches with one set of memories, and we never have any access to the others. The universe, in this view, is not a single line of events. It is an enormous, ever-branching tree. This sounds at first like the wildest kind of speculation, but within physics it is taken seriously as one of several legitimate interpretations of the same underlying mathematics. It is not the only interpretation, and many physicists prefer different ones. We do not need to commit to it, but it is worth turning it over gently in this conversation, because of what it would softly imply about endings. If many worlds is even partly correct, then every quantum event in your life has, in some sense, branched the universe. Most of these branchings would be too small to notice, but every now and then, perhaps, the small differences add up. A health decision that went one way in this branch may have gone the other way somewhere else. A near miss in traffic may have been an actual collision in a branch you never lived. A version of your life in some other branch took a different path entirely. The most striking corner of this idea has to do with the final moment. If many worlds is true, then in some branches the last thought you would have here is not actually the last thought, because in those branches the unlikely outcome happens. The heart restarts, the recovery comes, the conversation continues. There may be many versions of you scattered across an unimaginably vast tree in which the story does not yet end. It is important to be careful with this. It is not a claim, and it does not promise anything personal. Even if many worlds is correct, we do not know whether subjective experience follows any particular branch in any meaningful way. The mathematics is one thing. The implications for what a conscious life feels like across branches are far less certain. This is gentle territory, and many physicists do not enter it at all. But what the idea does, even as a possibility, is loosen our hard certainty that any one path is the whole story. The universe, viewed this way, is far more generous in possibilities than our usual picture allows. Endings, in this picture, are local, not absolute. A pattern that closes in one branch may continue, almost unrecognizably, in another. You do not have to believe this. you can simply notice that the universe, even in our most careful theories, often turns out to be larger and stranger than our fears assume. The last thought in any one place is real, but the last thought, in some deeper sense, may not be the only thought there ever was. In a quiet corner of theoretical physics, an idea has been growing for several decades that, at first, sounds almost too strange to take seriously. It is called the holographic principle. In its most careful form, it suggests that all the information inside a region of space can be described entirely by information on the boundary of that region, as if the inside of the universe were a kind of projection of patterns written on its outer edge. It is hard to picture, so it helps to start small. Imagine a glass globe filled with intricate, three-dimensional structures, tiny scenes, tiny figures, tiny moving stars. Now imagine that everything you could ever know about what is inside that globe could, in principle, be read off the inside surface of the glass. The interior would not, in some sense, contain anything that was not already encoded on the boundary. The space inside would be real, but it would not be the deepest level of description. The holographic principle, supported by certain mathematical correspondences such as the one called ad s sli fet, suggests that something analogous may be true of regions of space-time. The full physics of a volume could be equivalent, in a strict mathematical sense, to the physics of its boundary. The universe, on this view, would be a kind of self-consistent projection, with information at one level encoding information at another. No one is sure how far this idea extends. It works beautifully in certain theoretical models. Whether the real universe as we live in it follows this principle in its broadest form remains an open and active question, but the idea has changed how some physicists think about what space, information, and reality actually are. Now bring this gently into our long conversation about thought. If the deepest description of any region is on its boundary, then everything that has ever happened inside any region of space might be, in principle, encoded somewhere on that region's outer skin. Every interaction, every signal, every faint electromagnetic ripple from a thinking brain, all of it might leave a trace not only inside the local mess of matter, but on the larger informational boundary that holds it all together. This is highly speculative when applied to everyday life. We cannot, of course, point to a literal sheet of paper somewhere where our thoughts are inscribed, but the underlying principle gently encourages a certain kind of imagination. It suggests that information has a deeper, more woven existence than we usually assume, that what happens in one place is, in some careful sense, also represented elsewhere. If even a faint version of this is true of the universe, then the question of whether a thought leaves a trace becomes less strange than it once seemed. The thought is, in part, the local pattern of neurons firing, but it may also be, in some deeper informational sense, a small contribution to whatever larger structure holds it all together. The pattern is local. Its representation may be wider. We do not need to settle any of this tonight. The picture is offered gently, like a possibility resting on a table. The holographic whisper, if it is correct, would suggest that nothing fully real ever exists in only one place. Each moment is also part of a wider description, and the last thought, like every other thought, would not be entirely confined to the small space of the skull that produced it. It might also, in some quiet way, be part of the universe's own outer writing. There is one more thread of thought worth holding tonight, and it brings us close to the very edge of what physics is willing to say. It is the question of what consciousness is, at the most fundamental level, not how the brain produces it, but what it might be when seen in the most general possible light. Most working scientists treat consciousness as something that emerges from the activity of nervous systems. Build a sufficiently complex, sufficiently integrated brain, and somewhere in that complexity, awareness arises. This is a perfectly reasonable view, and it accounts for a great deal. But it does not answer a deeper puzzle, sometimes called the hard problem of consciousness. Why there is something it is like to be such a brain at all? Why is there an inside? Why does experience exist as a felt thing, rather than as pure mechanism? One framework that has tried to address this is integrated information theory. In simple terms, it suggests that the degree of conscious experience in a system depends on how richly its parts are connected, how much information the whole holds beyond what its pieces hold separately. A system that is highly integrated in this view has a kind of inner perspective, even in small forms. This is not yet proven. It is a research program more than a settled answer, but it has a striking implication that some take seriously. Consciousness may be more like a continuous property of certain natural systems than a sudden gift that arrives only in human-sized brains. A more daring extension of similar thinking, sometimes called panpsychism in its softer forms, suggests that some primitive form of experience may be a basic feature of reality, much as space, time, mass, and charge are basic features. Most physicists do not currently work with this idea. It remains deeply contested, but it is no longer the philosophical fringe it once was. Serious thinkers consider it carefully, precisely because the hard problem will not go away. If something along these lines is true, even faintly, then awareness might not be entirely confined to the inside of a head. The brain may not generate consciousness from nothing. It may shape and concentrate something more fundamental, the way a river shapes water that already existed in the rain. The richness of human experience would still be exceptional, but the underlying capacity for some form of experience might be much more widely distributed than we usually assume. This is offered gently as one of several possible interpretations, not as a claim. It sits in the family of ideas that should be held lightly, with curiosity rather than conviction. What this suggests, very softly, is a different way of imagining the last thought. In this picture, awareness is not a small lamp lit briefly inside a single brain and then snuffed out. It is perhaps more like a wave on an ocean, gathered momentarily into a particular shape by the structure of a single nervous system, and then, when that structure no longer holds, allowed to flow back into a wider field. There is something quietly consoling in this image, even without certainty. The mind, in this view, does not so much vanish as relax. The wave does not fight to remain a wave. It returns without effort to the larger water it was always quietly made of. Whatever the truth turns out to be, this gentle picture is at least allowed by the open spaces in our current understanding. So far, we have walked carefully through what physics and neuroscience hint at from the outside, but there is another, much older source of information about the final moments of the mind. The words of people who have come very close to death and returned. These accounts are, in the strict sense, not proof of anything beyond themselves, but they are real data, gathered across centuries, across cultures, across very different traditions. The patterns that emerge are quietly striking. People describe a feeling of profound calm, sometimes more vivid and more peaceful than anything they have known. They describe a sense of being held or surrounded, often without religious specifics. They describe in many cases a kind of inner clarity, as if a layer of ordinary fog had lifted, and they could see their life and their relationships with unusual gentleness. Modern researchers have begun to study these reports more systematically. The cardiologist Sam Parnia, for example, has led large multi-hospital studies, including a project sometimes referred to as AWARE, in which patients who survived cardiac arrest were interviewed soon afterwards. A meaningful fraction reported some form of awareness during the period when their hearts had stopped. Sometimes vivid memories, sometimes a sense of perspective shift, sometimes things they later said they would not have known otherwise. The findings are far from settled, but they are not nothing. There is another phenomenon, called terminal lucidity, that has been quietly documented for many decades. In some patients with severe brain damage or advanced dementia, a brief return of clarity sometimes appears in the days or hours before death. People who have not spoken meaningfully for months may suddenly speak again, recognize loved ones, share something they wanted to say, then they slip away. No one fully understands how this happens in brains that appear, by every other measure, to be deeply damaged. It is one of the small mysteries that does not fit the usual story. These reports are not in themselves scientific evidence of any particular afterlife or metaphysical claim. They are gentle, but they are not certainties. They are observations gathered from those who have been closer than the rest of us, for now, to that quiet edge. They tell us at minimum that the human mind near death is doing something rich and varied, sometimes peaceful, sometimes luminous, sometimes deeply meaningful to the person experiencing it. What is perhaps most consoling is the consistency of tone in many of these reports. Even allowing for cultural and personal differences, the experiences described tend to lean toward calm rather than terror, toward release rather than struggle, toward a sense of having been somehow met rather than abandoned. Of course, not all experiences are of this kind. Difficult deaths happen too, and they deserve their own honest acknowledgement. But the overall texture of the gentler reports is striking enough to mention with care. What might it mean that so many minds, in so many different settings, describe the edge of life in such surprisingly tender terms? We do not know. It may be partly chemical, partly cultural, partly something else we have not yet recognized. Tonight, we do not need to decide. We can simply notice that, whatever is happening in that strange territory, many who have visited it return saying the same quiet thing. It was not nothing, and it was not somehow unkind. There is a particular kind of peace that comes only when you stop trying to solve a question and simply sit beside it. The question of what the last thought is, what it feels like, where it goes, whether anything continues, is one of those rare questions where every honest mind, sooner or later, runs into the limits of what can be known. Science, for all its astonishing power, has clear edges. It can measure brains, map fields, count signals, model decay. It can suggest, propose, frame and refine. What it cannot do, at least not yet, is step inside another mind and report what the experience there was actually like. The view from inside is, for now, only ever available to one person at a time, and only briefly. Even the most advanced instruments leave that inner view untouched. Philosophers have a name for the deepest version of this puzzle. They sometimes call it the hard problem of consciousness, the question of why there is any felt experience at all. We can describe the physical processes of seeing the color red in extraordinary detail. We can trace every signal, name every neuron, and yet none of that description quite captures the inner redness of red, the way it actually feels to see. There is, between physical description and lived experience, a small but undeniable gap that no current science has fully closed. If this is true even for an ordinary moment, then how much more so for the final moment of life? We can describe the cascade, we can map the surge, we can speculate about chemistry and time, but what it is actually like, from inside, for one mind to dim into its own last edge, that remains at the deepest level, beyond direct verification. It would be tempting to feel anxious about this. The unknown is often imagined as cold or threatening, but there is another way to hold it. The unknown can also be a kind of generous space, a quiet room where neither fear nor certainty has the final word, and where the imagination is invited to live with humility rather than with terror. Across history, many traditions of thought have arrived at a similar gentle place. They have said, in different words, that the most honest response to the deepest questions is not a confident answer, but a respectful silence in which wonder is allowed to live. This is not avoidance, it is not cowardice. It is, in its own way, a kind of maturity, the acceptance that some questions are larger than any one mind, and that this is not a flaw of reality but one of its quietly beautiful features. There is a particular comfort in this for anyone who lies awake at night turning over the great questions. You do not have to solve them. You do not have to arrive. You do not have to be certain. You only have to keep company with the questions kindly, the way you would sit with an old friend whose stories you cannot fully understand but whose presence you trust. The not knowing, in this light, is not an enemy. It is the most spacious room in the house of being human. And the last thought, when it finally arrives, will arrive into that same gentle, unfinished space, not as a defeat for knowledge, but as a return to the deeper kind of openness that has been here all along. If a thought is a pattern, then so, in a larger sense, is a life. The way you speak, the way you laugh, the small phrases you use without thinking, the particular curve of your handwriting, all of these are patterns, sustained over years, made of the same kind of quiet electricity we have been tracing. And like all patterns, they do not stay only where they began. They ripple outward. Every conversation you have ever had has left small marks on other minds. Every kindness has rearranged, however slightly, the inner structure of another person's day. Every story you told, every song you sang, every gesture that someone noticed, has become part of the pattern of someone else's brain, not in any literal copy, but in subtle, persistent ways. In a real sense, fragments of your particular way of being have been quietly distributed across many other minds, and across the world you helped shape. Information theory, in its quiet way, gives this an interesting depth. When information passes from one system to another, from a brain, say, into a voice, into the ear of a listener, into another brain, it does not vanish from the first system. It is now in two places. As long as the second system holds it, the information has in effect multiplied. Each time you have shared anything genuine with another person, you have, very softly, made the pattern of yourself a little less local. This is part of why we feel so strongly the influence of those who have shaped us. Long after they are no longer physically present, certain of their phrases still rise in our heads. Certain of their gestures appear, unbidden, in our own. We catch ourselves saying something exactly the way they used to say it, and we feel them quietly present in the saying. This is not metaphor only. There is something real happening. Their pattern continues in modified form in us. If you take this idea seriously, it changes the meaning of the last thought. The last thought is, yes, the end of one local instance of you, the particular instance running in your particular nervous system, but it is not, at all, the end of the wider distribution. The you that lives in others, in subtle echoes and quiet imitations and inner conversations, continues to ripple onward. Long after the surge has softened, that ripple is still moving. Cultures, in a sense, are vast accumulated patterns of this kind. Languages are made of countless tiny rememberings. Songs and stories carry the patterns of long-dead minds into the awareness of living ones. We are, all of us, partly built out of people we will never meet, whose final thoughts passed long before our first ones. And in turn we are, very gently, building parts of those who will never meet us. This is not a substitute for anything else that may or may not happen after the final breath. It is its own quieter, simpler truth, available without any speculative leap. The pattern that you are is already, right now, slightly larger than your body. It is woven into the world you have touched, and that wider weave will keep moving forward in its own way, with or without your direct attention. There is something deeply consoling in this, especially in the quiet hours when one's smallness can feel sharp. You have already, without realizing it, been more far-reaching than you ever quite knew. There is a strange recursive quality to being alive. The universe, made of stars and dust and slow chemistry, somehow folds itself into beings that look back at it. From within the dark, an eye opens. From within the silence, a voice speaks. From within the slow motion of matter, a mind appears that can wonder why any of it should be here at all. This is so familiar that we forget how astonishing it is. The cosmos has, through us, become something that thinks about itself. Cosmologists sometimes speak of the anthropic perspective, the simple observation that the universe we find ourselves in must, at minimum, be the kind of universe that allows beings like us to exist. We are not separate from the conditions we describe. The fine balance of forces, the lifetime of stars, the chemistry of carbon, all of it had to be arranged in a way that permitted observers to arise inside it. We are not just here in the universe. We are here as the universe doing one of its rarer tricks. If you sit gently with this thought, something quietly stunning settles in. Every time you have a thought, the universe is having a thought, through you. Every time you notice something, a sound in another room, a memory rising of its own accord, a feeling that cannot quite be named, the cosmos is, in your small local form, briefly noticing itself. This is true of every thought you have ever had, and it is also true of the final one. Whatever the last thought turns out to be, it is also, in this view, one of the universe's many small acts of self-awareness, a moment when matter, organized into a particular pattern, glimpses itself once more before that organization changes. There is no need to make this grandiose. The universe is enormous, and an individual life is, by any cosmic measure, very brief. But that smallness is not the same as unimportance. Every act of being aware, in any nervous system anywhere, is something extraordinarily rare on the scale of all that exists. Mostly, the universe is rock and gas and silence. Now and then, in some quiet corner of it, awareness lights up. You are one of those places. When that awareness ends, in any one of those countless places, the universe does not lose itself. There are other places, other minds, other small lamps lit elsewhere in the dark, but a particular angle is no longer being looked from. A particular point of view, the one only you ever held, gently closes. There is something almost ceremonial in this. The cosmos, through you, has been quietly experiencing what it is like to be this body, this name, this set of memories, this corner of time. And one day, with the last thought, that particular experiment in self-knowing finishes its run. The materials return to the wider pool. The understanding gathered along the way joins, in some way none of us fully understand, the larger story of how the universe has been getting to know itself. This view does not push toward any single belief about what comes next. It simply offers a gentle reframing of what the last thought is, not only the end of you, but a small intimate moment of the cosmos saying, softly to itself, yes, I was here looking out for a while. And it is not by any small measure a meaningless thing for the cosmos to have done. There is a quiet practice that arises, almost without trying, when you have spent enough time near these questions. It is not a discipline imposed from outside. It is more like a soft adjustment in how attention settles. You begin to notice that the way you spend ordinary thoughts is, in some honest sense, practice for the way you will eventually spend the last one. The brain, after all, is a creature of habit. Researchers have shown in many careful ways how repeated patterns of attention shape the structure of neural tissue over time. The phrase used is neuroplasticity, the brain's lifelong tendency to wire itself toward whatever it does most often. A mind that returns again and again to anxious replay strengthens those circuits. A mind that returns again and again to quiet presence strengthens different ones. Over years, the inner landscape grows toward what the mind frequently visits. This is not a self-help slogan. It is simply how nervous tissue behaves, and it carries a gentle implication for our larger journey tonight. The textures of attention you practice across a lifetime become, in a real sense, the inner climate in which all your future thoughts will arise, including, eventually, the last one. Mindfulness research, conducted over decades now, gives a careful glimpse of this. People who spend regular time in slow, non-judgmental attention to the present often show measurable changes in how their brains process stress, fear, and uncertainty. They are not magically protected from hardship, but the same hardships seem to land in a slightly different inner shape. The noise of the world arrives into a calmer room without claiming anything beyond what is reasonable. We can quietly observe this. The kind of attention you practice today is part of what trains the kind of attention you will have at the end. Not in some mystical sense, in a quite ordinary biological sense. The grooves your mind walks in are slowly carved by the steps of your daily thinking. The last thought will arise in a mind that has been shaped by all the thoughts before it. This is not meant to add pressure. It is meant gently to relieve some. Most of life is made of small, unremarkable moments, and we often treat them as if they were merely waiting rooms before the more important parts. But each of those small moments is part of how the mind becomes itself. The patience you practice in a slow afternoon, the kindness you offer a stranger, the careful breath taken in a difficult instant, none of these are wasted. They quietly become part of the inner shape that will, one day, hold a final thought. In a sense, the last thought is being rehearsed all the time, not by direct effort, but by the texture of how you live. Every soft pause you have ever taken in the middle of a noisy day, every moment in which you let go of a worry just a little, every time you have allowed yourself simply to be present without solving anything, all of it has, very gently, been a small dress rehearsal for letting go. This is one of the rare cases where a deep cosmic question turns out to have a practical, immediate side. Live softly toward the last thought by softening this one. The final movement of the mind, whenever it comes, will arrive into the room you have been building inside yourself all along. By now, we have wandered through many quiet possibilities. The architecture of a single thought, the cascade of dimming, the surge that nobody quite expected, the conservation of energy, the conservation of information, the strange geometry of time and the soft suggestions of decoherence, different angles, different hints, none of them final. And yet, taken together, they seem to share a quiet shape. Whatever the last thought turns out to be, the universe we live in does not seem built for true erasure. Energy is conserved. Information, by our deepest theories, seems to be conserved. Patterns dissolve, yes, but their materials remain. Their ripples in the wider field of the world do not simply vanish. They soften, they redistribute, they join the larger ongoing. In this light, the final movement of the mind looks less like a falling away and more like a returning. A pattern briefly held in the warm tissue of a brain gently lets go of its hold. The energy that supported it flows back into the wider sea of heat and motion. The information that shaped it scatters into so many small interactions that no one will ever practically gather them, and yet in the strictest physical sense they are not gone. The cells that hosted the pattern release their grip slowly. The chemistry softens its edges. The electromagnetic hum that, for a lifetime, signed its faint signature into the surrounding air, lets that signature fade gradually outward into the larger field of the world. None of this happens harshly. It happens, in fact, in much the way ordinary fading happens every night, only further along the path. This is the gentle thread that runs beneath every quiet possibility we have explored tonight. The mind is not, in the universe's accounting, an exception to its more general grace. It is part of the same patient flow that moves clouds across a sky and slowly cools the heat from old stars. It rises, holds its shape for a while, and then softens back into what it came from. There is something deeply restful in this. We tend to imagine the end of a thought as a kind of unique tragedy, a small light snuffed out against a dark, indifferent background. But the more honestly we look, the less true this picture seems to be. The background is not indifferent in the way we feared. It is full of conservation, full of subtle continuities, full of long, slow rememberings encoded in the way the world unfolds. The last thought, whatever else it is, joins this wider story. It does not stand apart from the universe. It is part of how the universe is doing what it has always been doing, holding shapes for a while, then letting them soften. You do not need to grasp this firmly. You can hold it lightly. Tonight, as your own thoughts begin to drift, you can let the larger field receive them the way it always does. Each thought you release is, in its own small way, a practice in the same gentle motion, a pattern briefly held, returning to the wider water. It can be tempting to imagine that when thinking stops, everything stops. But the world has a quieter answer than that. Long after any one mind has gone still, the materials that briefly made it possible continue, in entirely new arrangements, to be part of the world. They do not remember being you, but they are still here. Consider for a soft moment where those materials originally came from. The carbon in your cells, the iron in your blood, the calcium in your bones, none of these formed on this planet. They were forged inside ancient stars billions of years ago and scattered into space when those stars finally ended their long lives. The atoms now humming gently in your body have already been through one great ending. They have already been through the death of suns. And here they are, briefly, organized into a mind that wonders about its own end. When the pattern of a particular life finally lets go, these atoms do not vanish. They return to the soil, the air, the rain. They are taken up in time by plants, by other creatures, by the wider chemistry of the planet. They will, eventually, find themselves in lives that have not yet begun. None of this is metaphor. It is the literal biography of matter on Earth. So in a quiet, factual way, much of what made you possible continues. The atoms keep going. The slow, patient recycling of matter has been happening for as long as there has been a planet at all. You are, in this sense, a particular and brief arrangement of materials that are themselves nearly as old as the universe. There is also another, less material kind of remaining. The patterns you left in other minds, the small phrases, the gestures, the moods you carried into rooms, continue to ripple outward in ways you cannot trace. They mix with the patterns of others. They become part of how strangers will one day treat strangers. They become part of how someone you loved will turn, decades from now, to a person you never met. This wider weave does not require any particular belief to be real. It is simply how influence travels through a connected world. The presence you brought is now part of the climate of others, however quietly, and those others will pass it on, knowingly or not, into a future that will be partly shaped by the way you once moved through your own days. What remains when thinking stops, then, is not nothing. It is matter, made of stars, returning to its long cycles. It is influence made of relationship, continuing to ripple. It is a particular configuration finished, yes, but a wider weave that the configuration helped form, still moving onward. You can rest in this thought tonight without needing to settle anything more. The last thought ends a single local pattern. It does not end the larger flow. The flow has always been larger than any of us, and it has very gently been carrying us all along. After so much talk of endings, it is worth pausing for one of the strangest facts of all, that there was ever a beginning, that out of all the possible configurations the universe could have settled into, somehow a planet formed, and on that planet conditions allowed life to arise, and that life eventually folded itself into beings that could lie in the dark and think about their own thinking. Researchers who study the origins of life often speak with great care, because the precise pathway is still being worked out. Some theoretical models propose ways in which simple chemistry could, under the right conditions, give rise to the first self-copying molecules. This remains an open and humbly held area of science. Whatever the exact mechanism, the outcome is staggering. Across the long quiet of the early planet, something began to happen that had not been happening before. Patterns started keeping themselves going. That thread of self-sustaining pattern, fragile at first, eventually led, through unimaginable stretches of time, to the particular pattern that is you. The chain of moments connecting the first faint stirring of life to your current breath is unbroken. Every link held, every ancestor, in every form, lived long enough to pass the pattern onward. Not one missed step, not one severed thread. When you sit with that, the present moment becomes a strange kind of miracle. Not in any loud sense, just in the quiet recognition that the bare fact of being aware, here, tonight, is the outcome of a vast lineage of unlikely continuations. The smallest things take on a different weight in this light. The simple sensation of breath moving in and out, the feel of the room around you, the soft attention with which your mind is listening to these words. These are not ordinary. They are extraordinary, dressed in the costume of the ordinary because they happen so often that we forget to notice. You do not have to do anything with this realization. You do not have to feel grateful on command or summon any particular reverence. You only have to let it be true gently, that being here at all is the rare and quiet thing. The universe has done a great many strange things over its long life. It has, here in this room, done one of its strangest. It has built itself a small place that is presently being aware of itself. The last thought, when it eventually comes, will be the closing of this small, rare configuration. But it will not undo the fact that the configuration ever was. That part is permanent. It happened. You happened. And on the wider scale of what could have been, that is no small thing. Let the wonder of this rest in you for a moment, without urgency. There is, even in the long quiet ahead, this one bright, simple truth, that there was something rather than nothing, and that, for a while, That something included you. So now, very gently, we can begin to let the long thread of this conversation soften. There is nothing more to solve tonight. There is nothing more to gather. There is only this room, this breath, this slow settling of attention as the world around you grows quieter and the inner light begins, in its own time, to dim. If anything from this journey has reached you, let it not be a conclusion but a feeling that the universe you live inside is, by its deepest patterns, gentler than it sometimes seems. That energy is conserved. That information may, in some quiet way, be conserved as well. That patterns soften back into the fields they came from. That endings, when they happen, do so the way evenings happen, slowly and without being asked. You are, right now, doing a smaller version of the very thing we have been speaking of. The mind, every night, releases its grip a little. Awareness loosens, the room grows distant. Some of the day's small worries are quietly let go, even when you do not consciously release them. Sleep is, in its own kindly way, a nightly rehearsal of letting go. Your body has done it thousands of times. It is very good at it, so you do not need to brace tonight. You do not need to hold. You do not need to keep anything from happening. You can simply let the breath come and go, and let the warmth find its place in your shoulders, and let the small, quieter movements of the body do what they already know how to do. Whatever has worried you today is permitted, just for these next moments, to rest beside the bed rather than in it. It will still be there in the morning, if it must be, but it does not need your company tonight. Your only task is to let the room grow soft. The last thought you will ever have is not for tonight. Tonight is for a much smaller, kinder version of letting go. Tonight is for the simple practice of trusting the universe enough to release one day's worth of thinking back into the wider field. That is all. Just one day. Just one soft loosening. Wherever your attention drifts now, to the warmth of the blanket, to the slow rhythm of your breath, to the quiet outside, to nothing in particular, let it drift. There is no wrong direction. The mind, like the universe it lives in, has always known how to soften towards stillness when finally given permission to do so. Rest now. The pattern that is you will hold itself perfectly well through the night. The wider field will keep its patient watch, and tomorrow, when awareness returns in its usual quiet way, the world will still be here, full of the same gentle mysteries, waiting to be wondered about again. For now, simply let yourself fall, kindly, into the soft, ordinary miracle of sleep.